is Rachel, this is Allie, and this is Rondey, and this is a special time in our service called Our Story, where we get to hear from members of our own community as they highlight some of what we talked about or heard in the lesson today. Allie is, let me get this right. I've been wanting to get Allie up here for a while to share about this. She's been certified through the Grief Recovery Institute, and she's a grief recovery specialist. So she has a lot to share with us. She's got a lot of training and a lot of knowledge. And then Rondey is a licensed clinical social worker. He's been one for over 21 years. He's worked with children and adults and families, and he's helped many people manage grief. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, maybe you guys can share with us individually how your specific expertise kind of helps in the grief process, or like your role in that process.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an honor to be up here. And yes, this is a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. So the grief recovery method, they define grief as the normal and natural reaction to loss of any kind. It's the conflicting emotions caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So it's not just death, divorce. Those are the most common, but it can be a loss of trust, a loss of hopes, dreams, expectations, right? And although grief is normal and loss is inevitable, these topics are often the most neglected and misunderstood experiences in being human. I really appreciated all that Elias pointed to today. And we're often taught how to acquire things, but we're not so much taught what to do when we lose them. And so oftentimes we see grieving people, we look at them, and their heads are not broken. Their hearts are broken, right? And because grief is emotional, you can't logic your way out of it. You need the correct tools for the job. It's for an example, if I was like, Rachel, can you please paint this room for me, but I'm going to give you a hammer to paint with. You might be able to, but you'd probably cause some pretty good damage along the way, right? And that's where the grief recovery method comes in. It helps educate, but also gives you the right tools, a process to move forward in your grief, which ultimately leads to becoming emotionally complete in that. And so that's what I've been trained in, and I love the program and for that reason.
How about for you?
Great. Well, funny as it is, therapy is often the place that people go to grieve a lot of things, the loss of a lot of things, the loss of a person, but also the loss of innocence. Maybe it's a loss that they had in their childhood, a loss of safety, a loss of identity, a loss of a job, a loss of a marriage. These are all grief processes, the things that activate a grief process, and sometimes people don't realize it as such. It just keeps coming up. And it doesn't feel resolved. And so being able to give people a structure and an understanding and normalizing some of the things that they're going through, bearing witness, supporting them as they're going through it. Pretty much as a therapy episode starts, someone's showing up because of something bad that's happened or something bad that's come up. And so through the process, you're walking with people for months and maybe years while that's playing out, and they get to the other side, and it's really pretty glorious. I feel very privileged to see God show up in so many situations, to see strengths emerge in people. So I just kind of bear witness and give people an understanding, and we grieve a lot of things, including the loss of a person, but it could be a loss of many things.
Yeah. Like Allie was saying.
Allie was saying.
So I went through the grief recovery course, and one of the things that stood out to me that surprised me, and I still hold on to, but I'm going to let you explain it, is the misconceptions or like myths around grief. So would you share those with us?
This is one of my favorite parts too. The first one is that there's no stages of grief. I know that's kind of like a common, which stage of your grief are you in? But grief has no absolutes because all relationships and losses are unique. We could have similarities, like maybe perhaps we've both lost a grandparent or experienced something, but our relationship to that loss is unique. And so to put you in a little category, to put a bubble around it, is actually doing a disservice. But there are some common myths or ways, I know Elias kind of alluded to maybe in our upbringing, what we were taught growing up on how to deal with the grief. And kind of those main 6 that they identify is don't cry, AKA just don't feel bad. just bury it, deny it, right? Just don't feel. Replace the loss. Just replace whatever was lost with something else, whether that's another similar object or another relationship. Grieve alone. If you're sad, do it alone and in your own time. Do not do that within community. Just give it time. Maybe you've heard the phrase, time heals all wounds. Time, I think wounds can be healed within time, but the time itself doesn't heal the wound, you know? Be strong, like being strong for others. Maybe, I have to be strong so that my family can grieve. I can't be the one to fall apart. And last is just keep busy. If I just keep busy, I won't feel anything. Like, I won't have to feel any pain, right? And these things, wrong page. None of these ideas actually complete the unfinished emotions. They just mask it. They don't actually attend to it. But yeah.
Rondey, as a professional clinical counselor, therapist, how do these misconceptions or griefs that we carry around about grief, how do they hurt us? Like, what are some of the negative consequences of believing or leaning into these misconceptions?
Yeah, so, so what you're referring to, and many people probably heard, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had these 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I think what people have discovered is that they're not linear. They don't necessarily go through these steps, and they cycle a lot. Sometimes you may feel one and then go back to another. But the phenomenon that they describe definitely give people a framework to understand what they're experiencing. So denial, I can't believe this is true. Anger, dang, this is true. Bargaining, if I was only different, if I was only there, if I could have done this differently. Depression is where you have despair because you can't change the reality. And then acceptance is where you integrate this new reality into your story. And I think the harm comes from thinking that it has to go in that stepwise fashion. But those kind of feelings and experiences are normal. And I think it's good for people to understand that many people go through those things in the journey.
Thank you.
Yep.
I lost my grandpa when I was pregnant with my oldest, and it was pretty significant. I hadn't lost anybody before that, and my grandpa was also like the first man that ever loved me. So it was a pretty significant relationship, or like that was my experience with him, right? Like he was the safest. That's where I learned like what it meant to be someone's favorite, like out of everybody in my family. So it was a very significant relationship when I lost him, and I had already gone through the grief recovery. And I remember that process, I felt very bipolar because I would cry out of nowhere, or just images would flood my memory. And then I would cry, but it'd be like I'd cry, I'd be weeping, and then I'd be like laughing again, or I'd be talking to somebody and something would just trigger the memory of my grandpa, and then I would just be again like just so sorrowful and weeping, and then kind of turn around and start talking again like nothing had happened. And I had kind of learned to let that go. Like I remember going through it and being like, this feels really weird, but my grief recovery person told me to let it happen. So why was I taught that? What is that process about?
No, I love what Rondey had just mentioned about it being, it's not linear, it's like cyclical, and it could be in any order, That's so well said. And I think one of the things that the grief recovery method teaches is that we often participate in what they call Academy Award recovery, which is kind of this like, I need to act recovered in order to fit in, and I'm fine, right? Everything's great, and we do that out of fear, right? We do it out of fear of being judged or criticized. Will people understand? But the I'm fine attitude just creates a scab over this big wound. And I don't have to paint an image for you to think about what that is, But unresolved grief, it consumes a massive amount of energy. And when grief stays buried, only the symptoms are treated. We're not actually dealing with the underlying grief. And as humans, our energy is used most efficiently when our minds and bodies are working together. But when we don't have that unresolved grief, those things are completely separated. And so when we try and stop our emotions, we don't, we try to control and bottle them up, only show them when I'm alone or in the right
Like appropriate.
Yeah,
or-
yeah, versus just feeling them and emoting and letting the waves come. And even if it is awkward and weird, we miss out on that true healing, and we don't experience our best lives. Unresolved loss is cumulative and cumulative negative, which affects how we view ourselves, our relationships, and the world around us.
Yeah, unresolved loss is a really important idea. Want to even actually kind of unpack that a little bit. The Zygarnik effect. So this Russian psychologist, Dr. Bulima Zygarnik, she was in a coffee shop and she was observing the wait staff taking orders, and noticed that they weren't writing the orders down. And but they were able to fulfill these orders, and she was amazed at this phenomenon. And maybe you've also seen it in wait staff that can memorize all these things. And then she thought she had an idea that she wanted to ask them after they fulfilled the order. Can you remember what that guy ordered? Can you remember what that guy ordered? And you know what? The wait staff couldn't. And when they explored it, they understood that order that hadn't been fulfilled carried a tension inside of that wait staff psychology that kept it on the forefront until it was fulfilled, and then she didn't need to remember it anymore. And this effect actually is the backbone of really all these therapeutic processes, that we all have stories that we're in the middle of that don't feel resolved. It's when you go to bed and you remember the thing you forgot in the day. It's when you things pop up in your psyche, and maybe if you repeat a story or you see someone repeat a story, that's because it's not resolved. And grief, especially death, sickness, is a story that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel finished. But you know what's really powerful about the story that Elias shared is Jesus agrees. I heard a sermon when my sister-in-law had passed a couple years ago that really helped me, that took that word that's, when it says he was deeply moved with compassion, it meant to snort like an animal. The Greek word means to snort like an animal. So he was ugly crying, even though he knew he was about to resurrect him in a minute, right? Because this isn't supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be this way. So that lack of resolve that we feel actually is a common experience, is a common human experience. And just to kind of illustrate that a little bit more, can't really see this, but this is an inventory of complicated grief. So this is a clinical tool available, you could Google it, that basically is questions to help you to assess if your grief is resolved or not. And so it's 19 items that say things like, I think about this person so much that it's hard for me to do the things I normally do. Or memories of this person who died upset me. I cannot accept the death of the person who died. I feel myself longing for the person who died. I feel drawn to places and things associated with the person, etc. And there's a 0 all the way up to 4, never all the way up to always. And through this, we kind of can assess whether or not grief is resolved or not, and how unresolved it is. Available online. But yeah, it's an actual thing. Complicated grief is when we haven't finished the story. It's an open loop. It's the cliffhanger at the end of a movie that does it. You can't sleep until you find out the ending. But that's a small version. But in a bigger, more painful version, that's what grief is.
Would it be fair to? Are there just times where like you won't ever complete the grief loop, kind of like to Psalm 88, right? Like I might never get over. Like I might never get over my grandpa dying, right?
Yeah.
So like what's that dance of I don't feel stunted by it, or it's not affecting my life, but like I don't think I'll ever just be okay with not having him.
Yeah. Yeah. So acceptance is where you assign meaning to it. You put it in a context. And for us, we have the benefit of thinking about it in the context of God's plan, right? And what happened with Lazarus is all the grievers who were at that funeral were converted, and it started a mass movement, because if Lazarus hadn't died, if there wasn't for that funeral, all those people would not have heard the gospel, right? But the presence of all these mourners getting to hear the word, it had a tremendous effect in spreading the gospel, right? And when we can put our loss says, in a story, in God's bigger story, right? And trust, even when we don't know that it had a reason, that helps us to make sense. And then even when we can resolve from that in order to honor that person, this is where, foundations come from, statues come from, heroes, I'm always going to do this, I'm never going to do that, in order to honor this person. This is also how we make sense. The sadness, will always be there, because that's just part of life in this world. But there's a lot of redemption that can come when we take that suffering and allow it to form something in us and through us, and pay some good in the world. And and that's also Romans 5 and the scriptures that we looked at is about that.
Thank you. It's so helpful. I'm going to switch to something that's maybe not as heavy as losing somebody physically, but we lose things all the time, right? It could be like a job or an ideology, feeling of safety, and then we kind of respond to them in our own different ways. There was a time where I found myself at a store, mindlessly shopping, like going through the racks. I couldn't really remember why I was there. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't need anything, but there I was. And as I kind of like got in touch with myself, like, what's happening? I realized, I had just watched a really sad video at church about some of the Hope villages and some of the kids, and it had really, really affected me. And so I was sturbing. That was kind of my escapism. Maybe you can share what that means.
Yes, so the grief recovery method has a term called STERBs, STERB, which are short-term energy relieving behaviors. And these are actions we participate in to relieve some of the energy that unresolved grief creates. It's that escapism that Elias pointed to earlier, right? So they give this great analogy of a tea kettle. When you think about a tea kettle on a stove, right? If it's over a hot flame, they have that little whistle function that alerts you, hey, take it off, like it's got to come off. Well, imagine instead of the little whistle, there's a cork in it. And so this tea kettle is just building and building and building, right? Well, the energy's got to go somewhere. Otherwise, it's going to be a hot, hot mess, both physically and figuratively. So when we try to relieve some of that pressure, we turn to our STERBs, right? And those STERBs can include food, alcohol, drugs, anger, exercise, isolation, movies, books, TV, sex, shopping, workaholism, religion even, right? These things aren't bad in and of themselves. Like, none of those things are wrong, but it's when we use them for the wrong reasons. And the issue with STERBs is that they kind of work, but they don't really make us better. They just make us feel different. They just shift the focus, right? It's that illusion of recovery. And they're short term, so you have to keep going back to them, right? You get that hit. Only this much of energy is released, but then you put the cork right back in, and then you're like, well, I got to do this again, right? And they don't do anything to actually deal with the cork in the spout. They just quickly move it in or out and back in. Yeah, so those are STERBs.
I used to like to sturb a lot, shopping. Woo! But I've worked a lot on being in touch. But maybe you can share from a clinical perspective, like what happens to us when we're not in touch, when we're unable to get in touch. Like, what are some of the negative effects there?
Yeah, so that unresolved grief, it can obviously lead to despair, depression, make you despair of life. It can, and a true clinical depression where you maybe lack energy, lack motivation, can even, not want to live, right? That can in the greatest extreme. It could also create, depending on how the death happened, traumatic kind of experiences you flash back. You have intrusive thoughts about a person, maybe how they passed, or a fear that could happen to you too, right? Things like that are kind of more of a traumatic reaction. Those are some of the things that could happen when it's not.
Yeah. Super helpful stuff. Maybe not lastly, but Allie and Rondey, in your specialty, in your profession, what are the benefits that you've seen? I mean, in the beginning you shared like how you've helped people, right? Like navigate this, but for you personally, what are some of the benefits that you've experienced helping people go through this process?
It's so rewarding. And I feel really honored to be sitting up here next to Rondey. I have such high regard for therapy and all the work it is, and it's just amazing. But I know for me personally, my own personal growth and healing, becoming emotionally complete with my losses that I've experienced in my life, so that I can move forward, so that I can be more present, right? I'm able to truly forgive. Forgiveness is a huge part of the grief recovery method, which is one of the reasons I love it, because that's so God's heart, right? But really being able to see God's heart and design with grief, and how it's a part of the human experience, and how we shouldn't be afraid of it. And that's for me too. Like, I feel like grief used to be really scary, and it used to be really like, I don't want to touch that. Or if someone else is going through grief, it was like, run away, right? But I don't have to fear it. I have the proper language and tools to navigate it. And for me personally, I just have a really strong passion of raising up the next generation to also be able to deal with that. One, in our own home, but also within like the campus, and we used to work with teens. Like, it just being able to pass that on, but certainly seeing it on other people. Oh my goodness, just the true freedom and healing that understanding and resolving grief brings is just, it's life-changing. It truly is.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great honor. I feel, to bear witness to some of the greatest examples of strength and courage, right? I've seen, so many people show up and say, I'll never get through X, right? And then you bear witness and you support them and you watch it unfold, and the strength on the other side really builds my faith. I get to see God, when you talk about, again, like Lazarus, when there are other reasons in their life and this loss leads to something else that God was doing, I get to see that all the time. And over the years of my faith, just had a 36th spiritual birthday, my heroes have shifted. And I think I've shared this in a sermon or two, that I used to admire the eloquent, powerful speaker, but now I admire people who suffer well, because suffering is inevitable. And it's a turning point for many people in their faith. They're going to curse God and say, God, how could you? Or they're going to draw closer to God. And I'm taking note of people that are drawing closer to God and are walking through faithfully. And I say, Lord, not if, but when my turn comes, please let me be like that. Please. So I've gotten to bear witness and have some amazing examples. And it gives me some deep framework for my theology. And I wanted to share a couple of books that so Kurt Thompson, I'm a big fan of this guy. He's a Christian psychiatrist, wrote that book, The Deepest Place, which is basically an unpacking of Romans 5 and suffering, and how God uses suffering, and how he shapes us in suffering. And then the one on the right, Suffering in the Heart of God, Diane Langberg, she's like a cutting-edge trauma therapist who works with the high levels of church-related abuse and scandals, and has seen pain just on levels that are kind of unthinkable for a lot of people. And so what she does is she makes sense of what she's struggling with, in terms of seeing, horrific situations of abuse through life. And it's just really profound and deep, and a little lighter, but also very useful. People have read this, How People Grow. There's a chapter in there dedicated to grief. They call grief the master emotion. That learning to manage grief teaches you how to manage all the others, right? And they talk about what it looks like when it's healthy in this chapter. So I feel like it's given me so much instruction for life. I feel like I've gotten to see miracles right up close. I feel like I've gotten vivid examples of how I hope to be, when seasons come in my life, for sure.
Thank you both so much. I know there's so many more questions I have, but I know we're short on time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the work that you do. I'm very grateful that as a church we're leaning into this right now. That I wanted to talk more about just like the role of community through all this. Like not going at it alone. But I'm sure we will continue the conversations. Thank you guys so much.